Hello, Dr. Grande here. Today I'll be taking a look at the Lindsay Clancy case. I'll offer an update on this case. I talked about it some time ago after the incident originally occurred. A lot of information came out about the case, which I included in my first video. Most of it dealt with the hours leading up to the killings. There wasn't a lot of information about what caused the killings, what may have caused it, like the mental health components. There was some information, but new information has become available. Lindsay Clancy's husband gave an interview to The New Yorker, which really, I think, puts this case into a new perspective. It adds critical information that I think a lot of people wanted to know right after the incident happened. So now it's available, so I'll talk about it, and I'll go through the background, including the timeline of the crime, while incorporating the new information that's been reported in The New Yorker. After this, I'll offer my thoughts about this case. Lindsay Clancy was born on August 11, 1990, and raised in Wallingford, Connecticut. She graduated from high school and later from college. At some point, she found work as a labor and delivery nurse at a hospital in the state of Massachusetts. In the summer of 2013, she met a man named Patrick Clancy. They married in December 2016. They lived in the town of Duxbury, about 43 minutes south of Boston. Their house was located on Summer Street. It was 1,700 square feet and had 3 bedrooms. This is considered kind of an upscale area. They had a daughter named Cora in December 2017, a son named Dawson in September 2019, and a son named Callan in May 2022. Really, a lot of people looked at this couple and thought they had the ideal life. They were building a family. Everything seemed to be on course. They appeared to be well-adjusted. Lindsay joked with her colleagues about wanting enough children to fill a baseball team. She had a desire to get pregnant again after her 3rd child. Lindsay did not return to full-time work after having her first 2 children. She went back part-time, and she experienced a lot of anxiety. She would monitor her children using her cell phone at work, like she had some type of video feed set up and she would watch the children from there. One time she saw Cora crying on the video feed, so she called the police and asked for a wellness check. Lindsay said that Patrick did not answer the phone when she called. So at this point, Lindsay certainly seemed attentive and she was worried about the welfare of her children. Maybe she was a little too concerned. She was overreacting a little bit. After having her 3rd child, Lindsay was experiencing a lot of anxiety about returning to work. So full-time work was on the horizon. Lindsay knew that that's what she wanted to do, or at least she thought that is what she wanted to do, but she was having difficulty with the feelings of anxiety. She met with a psychotherapist, but they didn't connect. It sounds like the therapeutic alliance never formed. There's no explanation about how they didn't connect. I think this is important. When somebody goes to see a counselor or a similar psychotherapist, the relationship ideally should form right away, the therapeutic alliance. I think that if it doesn't, it is critical to find out why. I don't think it should be something that's just swept under the rug, like, oh, they didn't connect. Okay, well, that's fine, but why didn't they connect? What happened? Was it something that the counselor did that they shouldn't have done? Was it something that the client did that they shouldn't have done? Were there other factors at play? It's really, I think, important to understand this. And we just hear about this kind of failure to connect in this story, and that's it. That's all there is on this. There's a lot more emphasis on what happened with the drugs I'll talk about in a moment, but really not much discussion about what happened with the counseling. I think that counseling could have had a good chance of improving Lindsay's mood based on the symptoms that she indicated, but the counselor or whatever psychotherapist identity was involved never had a chance. Eventually, Lindsay saw a clinician who prescribed her Zoloft and Ativan. So the Ativan was to help her sleep because of the insomnia side effect of the Zoloft. She was diagnosed with generalized anxiety disorder. So this is when a person experiences anxiety on a regular basis. This doesn't include panic. Panic would be something else. Generalized anxiety disorder can be devastating but it's usually not associated with homicide or any type of criminal behavior. At this point, Lindsay's husband was getting concerned about how the treatment was very focused on drugs. There wasn't really any counseling. It was just prescription medication. By November 2022, Lindsay didn't have much of an appetite, and she was isolated. She had postponed her return to work due to the mental health symptoms. On one occasion, she was rocking back and forth on a living room couch, terrified, and her heart was racing. She drove herself to an emergency room after going 2 nights without sleeping. She was prescribed Ambien, which is a sedative often prescribed to help people sleep. Lindsay found a new prescriber at some point. She eventually received many more drugs, including Valium, Trazodone, Klonopin, Prozac, Remeron, Lamictal, Benadryl, and Seroquel. She was taking up to 4 medications a day at this point, and she was taking them as prescribed. She was following the rules. Lindsay visited a hospital on December 20, 2022. At that time, the clinician found no symptoms of postpartum depression. This becomes pretty important later. The clinicians may have been hesitant to make a diagnosis because they did not know what was coming from the drugs and what was coming from the symptoms. This is one of the many difficulties which can arise from taking psychotropic medications. So the drugs can cause mood problems. The drugs can cause symptoms. So the clinicians just became confused. I think this is what could have happened. They became confused. They just didn't want to commit to a diagnosis unless they could separate the effect of the drugs from the effect of the original symptoms. This was not possible. By the end of December, Lindsay was having thoughts of wanting to die, and she felt numb about having those thoughts. She also had thoughts of harming her 3 children. Clinicians suggested if Lindsay did not have a plan and she was disturbed by the thoughts, meaning the thoughts were adverse to her will, then they were probably just thoughts. There was nothing really to worry about. This seems overly dismissive in light of what happened, but at the time, I can kind of understand what the clinicians were thinking. A lot of people come in to treatment with disturbing thoughts. Few people act on them. So every time a person mentions the thought of doing harm to themselves or someone else, a clinician can't react dramatically. They have to be logical and look at the situation. It's not helpful when clinicians start over-responding to everything because clients won't share information then. Clients need to be able to talk about their thoughts freely. On New Year's Day, 2023, Lindsay went into an inpatient program. Looking around at the other patients, she didn't think that she belonged there. They looked like they were much worse off than she was. She was given amitriptyline. This was her 13th medication in just 4 months. She was discharged from this inpatient facility after 5 days. On January 24, 2023, Lindsay Clancy took her daughter Cora to an appointment with a pediatrician. After this, they returned home. Lindsay played with Cora and Dawson in the snow, built a snowman, and texted photographs of the children to Patrick and her mother. Didn't seem out of the ordinary. There was nothing in that behavior that was alarming or disturbing. At 4:53 p.m., Lindsay sent a text message to Patrick, who at that time was working in the basement of their house. She asked him if he would go pick up takeout. Lindsay placed an order at 5:10 p.m. The restaurant she selected was farther away than usual. Patrick left 5 minutes later to pick up the food. Lindsay also wanted him to stop at a CVS while he was out. He arrived home from these 2 stops at 6:09 p.m. There was no sign of Lindsay or the children. Patrick called 911 at 6:11 p.m., just 2 minutes after arriving home, after seeing blood on the floor and noticing that windows were open. While on the phone with the operator, Patrick ran to the backyard and found his wife on the ground. Lindsay told him their children were in the basement. Emergency responders arrived. They found that Lindsay had attacked all 3 children by strangling them with exercise bands. Cora and Dawson were killed immediately. Cowan was mortally wounded and died 3 days later. After conducting the attack, Lindsay made her way out of a second-story window and was severely injured upon landing on the ground. She also had cuts on her neck and wrists. Lindsay was transported to a hospital and treated for severe injuries to her spine. She was paralyzed from the waist down. Lindsay was charged with murder, strangulation or suffocation, and assault and battery with a dangerous weapon. Here are my thoughts on this case. Clearly, these killings were horrific, and Lindsay's behavior was peculiar given her history. She had no criminal record. Nobody suspected that anything like this could happen. There is no reason to believe that she would have ever offended in any way, much less this way that was particularly heinous. The state believes the killings were premeditated. In their opinion, these were murders. 4 days before the killings, Lindsay searched "Can you treat a sociopath?" and "Ways to kill." Furthermore, she sent Patrick out to make a few stops, which gave her time to carry out the killings. Lindsay's attempt to harm herself is considered half-hearted by the state. They believe the cuts were superficial, and as far as hitting the ground and damaging her spine, they thought that Lindsay did not understand the ground was frozen. She thought she would have a softer landing. It's hard to know if this is correct or not, but this is their point of view, that really this was a premeditated crime and Lindsay should go to prison for the rest of her life. That's how they're viewing it. I think that Lindsay has a real chance of avoiding a conviction, especially because this happened in Massachusetts. In this state, a defendant can be found not guilty by reason of insanity if they lack the capacity to conform their conduct to the requirements of law. This is applicable even if the person understood the difference between right and wrong. So Massachusetts is a little more generous toward this insanity defense than many other states. In many jurisdictions, only the failure to understand the difference between right and wrong can be used as part of the defense. Patrick and many people who worked with Lindsay, like nurses that work with her, believe that her mental health symptoms caused her behavior. Patrick said, "I wasn't married to a monster. I was married to someone who got sick." In my first video about this case, I talked about how I believed Lindsay was not guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. At that point, I just was not convinced, and after seeing this new information, I remain unconvinced. I believe she is not guilty beyond a reasonable doubt based on the evidence presented so far. Her defense has two strategies they can employ, and it appears as though they're interested in both of these. The first one is that Lindsay was taking too many medications. This restricted her ability to understand the difference between right and wrong. She was on 3 medications at the time of the killings, but 13 different medications in the last 8 months. The second strategy revolves around postpartum psychosis. So 50 to 80% of new mothers will experience postpartum depression. Only 0.2% of new mothers will experience postpartum psychosis. So even though postpartum depression is common, postpartum psychosis is not. However, when it does occur, when the psychosis occurs, it is extremely dangerous. A child of a mother who has postpartum psychosis has a 4% chance of being murdered in the first year of their life. So a 1 in 25 chance. Those are not good odds considering the severity of murder. This case focused a lot of attention on the role of psychotropic medication. I think this is going to be a critical part of the defense. Lindsay was overloaded with the drugs. These affected her ability to reason, again, to understand the difference between right and wrong. This should not have happened. So really, in a sense, Lindsay was a victim of a broken mental health treatment system. Why was Lindsay given so many drugs? How was the effectiveness of the drugs measured? At times, it seems almost random, like the drugs were being passed out without much thought. This is, again, what the defense could argue. Here's how I look at this. There are 2 main ways to treat mental illness: counseling and medication. That's pretty much it for most people, right? They're going to choose between going to a counselor or someone similar to that, like a psychotherapist from another professional identity, or going to somebody who can prescribe medication, whether it's a primary care physician, a psychiatrist, a psychiatric nurse practitioner. They're going to go somewhere to find access to these medications. Both strategies are important, in my opinion. Some mental disorders and symptoms only respond to counseling. Others only respond to medication. but most will respond to both to some degree. So both represent valuable tools. With that in mind, in my opinion, with a few exceptions, counseling should pretty much always be tried before medication. One exception would include disorders involving psychosis. It's worth noting that Lindsay was never diagnosed with anything involving psychosis. So maybe moving right to prescription medication wasn't a good idea when counseling was still available. Yes, Lindsay didn't connect with one counselor or psychotherapist, but she may have connected with another. So perhaps that strategy, looking at counseling, was abandoned too early. Here are a few reasons that I favor counseling over prescription medication in most cases. So at the beginning of this list would be how counseling can help a person get at root causes, whereas drugs will not. So if a person has anxiety, depression, obsessive compulsive symptoms, panic, or any number of other symptoms that could be caused by dysfunctional thinking, personality traits, trauma, impulsivity, the root causes are important. It's important to understand what led to the symptoms. Sometimes understanding isn't possible, but often some clarity can be offered on this subject. For the most part, drugs don't do anything to help in the area of building insight or knowledge about the cause of symptoms. Drugs are about concealing the symptoms. Now, of course, this can be helpful, but I don't think it's the answer. One could argue that some prescribers may look at various symptoms and say, what caused them? Who knows? Who cares? Here's a pill. It's kind of flippant and fatalistic, like everything is hopeless. That's not a good message for a client. To me, this is kind of like if a person has a slow leak in one of their car tires, right? Maybe there is like a nail or some other piece of metal kind of stuck in the tread, and it's not leaking quickly, like it might be several days before the tire looks like it's low on pressure, but it is leaking. So they go to like a tire shop and they can have the nail pulled out and a plug put in, or they can get a new tire or whatever. But instead, the mechanic keeps filling the tire with air. Well, that will kind of solve the problem. I mean, that's a solution, sort of. It'll make the car reasonably safe to drive, and it won't feel any different, won't function any differently. But it's not really the solution, right? Removing the nail, fixing the tire, or replacing the tire is definitely the way to go in the long run, right? Finding the root cause, what's causing the leak, and then fixing that root cause. Something else to consider here is that not identifying root causes is problematic because those root causes can lead to other problems, other symptoms, and it can make assessment really difficult. This happened in the case of Lindsay Clancy. As I talked about, clinicians appeared to be afraid to diagnose her because they could not separate the effects of the drugs and the original symptoms. The next reason I like counseling over medication in most instances is how counseling helps clients build coping skills. They can develop practical skills to manage anxiety, depression, and stress, for instance. It's about teaching. It's about imparting lasting benefits to the client. The client does not need to go to a counselor forever, right? They'll reach a point where through maybe cognitive behavior therapy or something like that, they've learned coping skills. They've learned how to manage. Now, maybe they'll need to come in later for other symptoms or whatever, but it won't be constant. It won't be the entire lifespan that's spent in a counseling relationship. With prescription medication, when the drugs stop, so does the benefit. A client has to see a prescriber eternally. It's the relationship that never ends. The next item here would be how counseling has practically no side effects. There's no dependence on counseling, not usually. There's no weight gain. There's no sexual dysfunction. There's no fatigue. Prescription drugs have plenty of side effects, and some of those drugs can lead to addiction. For example, benzodiazepines. Now, some people favor counseling over drugs because of the precision of treatment, right? They think that counseling strategies make more sense, like the treatments match the symptoms, or sometimes with drugs, the treatment seems kind of random. Unfortunately, both counseling and drugs involve some degree of trial and error. However, prescribers do tend to do this a little bit more than counselors. Like, try this drug. Oh, that didn't work. We'll try this one. Oh, that didn't work. Try this one over here. It just never ends, one drug after the other, until they find something that works. Now, in a world with no side effects, I guess that would be an okay strategy, but counseling's a little more precise in this sense. It's not great. It's not great in the area of precision, but a little more precise. Counselors can look at the various symptoms, look at the history, and then create a counseling strategy that's based on science. Another point with this trial and error system with drugs, I think this gets particularly worrisome when a person is given multiple drugs, right? So with a lot of these drugs, prescribers don't know exactly why they work or how they work. When drugs are stacked on top of other drugs, the math becomes even more difficult to calculate. If they don't know how one drug worked, how would they understand the interaction between 2, 3, or 4 drugs? I think what happens with a lot of people who are experiencing mental health symptoms is that they want a quick fix, right? The symptoms are terrible. It's understandable. They want the symptoms to go away. Drugs are popular for this reason, right? They, in theory, get rid of symptoms quickly and allow a person to move on. Who cares what caused it? Who cares that those causes could come up in other ways? Let's just fix the symptom and get away from this situation. As I mentioned, however, a person ends up stuck with a prescriber for years, if not their whole life. So they're really not escaping. They're just taking a drug instead of seeing a counselor every week or a couple times a week. Another reason overprescribing is rampant is because drugs make companies a lot of money. The pharmaceutical industry pushes drugs aggressively. It's a big business. Now, many drugs are helpful, but I don't know if that really matters to the drug companies. As long as they're making money, they seem like they're pretty happy. So do their financial interests align with helpful treatment from time to time? Of course. But I think a lot of the time there's a disconnect there. It's really just about earning money. I think the proportion of how people use counseling versus drugs is out of alignment. Right now, and this is just an estimate, about 35% of people only see a counselor or some other type of psychotherapist. So they have symptoms of a mental disorder or maybe multiple mental disorders, and they will just see a counselor. About 35% see both a counselor and a prescriber. This is a common strategy, and this often works pretty well. About 30% only receive medications, so they're only seeing a prescriber. This percentage, in my opinion, should be more like, this breakdown should be more like 65% counselor only, 25% both counselor and prescriber, and 10% prescriber only. To me, that makes more sense based on the frequency of different mental disorders. Many people do fine with just counseling. A smaller group needs counseling and medication. And then, like I said, about 10% would benefit from just the medication. They don't need or should not see a counselor. It's hard to really justify the no counselor strategy, but I have seen cases where people, they kind of know what the symptoms are. Counseling didn't work, so they just go and get the prescription medication, and that seems to work out okay for them. Again, I don't think this should happen too often, but there is a place for it. Again, both counseling and drugs have an important role to play in the treatment of mental disorders. Now, I've talked a lot about overprescribing and how this is bad for clients and the mental health treatment community in general. But this is not all the fault of the drug companies. This is not all the fault of prescribers. The counseling profession and other related psychotherapy professions need some work as well. There needs to be more of an emphasis on supervision. There needs to be better training and a renewed commitment to reason and logic. This field is vulnerable to New Age philosophy and other fantastical influences. I've seen this many times in my career. I've worked with many counselors and members of many different psychotherapy professions on areas like assessment, treatment modalities like cognitive behavioral therapy, and all types of other areas. I've done a lot of consultation, a lot of supervision, and I see there is a good amount of interest in kind of, I guess, what you could consider the mundane activities of the profession, right? Things that aren't really fancy or dramatic, just normal everyday work. But there's also an attraction to the elements that are more fascinating, like dissociative identity disorder, a disorder that I'm not sure really even exists. But there's an overwhelming amount of interest in those type of things, in the areas that are a little more controversial. Unfortunately, this seems to be a trend. That's, I think, a particular problem for many of the psychotherapy professions. So it's not just, drugs are bad and counseling is perfect. I don't think either one is bad. I think that each have strengths and weaknesses. It's about using both treatment strategies appropriately. Moving back to the case of Lindsay Clancy, I talked about how she didn't connect with a counselor. This probably did not seem like a big problem at the time. But if that therapeutic alliance had formed, maybe the killings could have been prevented. I don't know, but it's a possibility. One thing is for certain, however, the drug strategy did not lead to a positive outcome. I don't know if the drugs caused the killings or anything like that, but certainly this was a horrific outcome in this case. 3 children were dead. It's hard to imagine that counseling would have performed any worse. That pretty much does it for my thoughts on the Lindsay Clancy case. It's certainly a case that has drawn a lot of attention to mental health treatment and how precise or imprecise the treatment is. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll talk to you soon.